A sniper attack on a California electrical substation last year, now raising concerns all over the country. Was it terrorism? We've been on this story for the last month, but here with the latest is Dominic DiNatale. Hi, Dominic. Can you tell us what happened in San Jose?
Well, what happened in San Jose, this was April last year, and effectively there was an unknown number of gunmen who attacked the Metcalfe substation in Silicon Valley. They opened up with at least 100 to 150 rounds on power lines and on power stations and installation points. That caused part of the grid to go down. Fortunately, it didn't take out all of Silicon Valley, much as people feared it could have at the time. PG&E, the utility, claimed this was just vandalism. Now the former head of the regulator here in the United States says it was terrorism, something the FBI denies. It's caused an absolute furore, including, well, in Washington, where now a group of Democrat senators want to know from the regulators just how well protected the grid really is, and whether indeed utilities have really taken adequate steps to prevent this from happening. And no one seems to know, and that's why it's turned into a debacle, Judge.
Well, you know, Dominic, what is unusual about this is that this thing happened last April, and we're now just hearing about it. It's as though nobody really cared until it kind of got out. But when you talk about the fact that you had a sniper attack, I understand it was something like 20 minutes of shooting at the substation after they then cut the telephone lines. I mean, this is more sophisticated than just your run-of-the-mill vandalism. Don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, the head of the main regulator, better known as FERC, or the former head, I should say, he said these guys were well trained. And so with a 20-minute attack, he felt that it was perhaps a precursor to an even bigger attack, almost as if it was a training mission somewhat. That really has got people very, very alarmed. And so the senators in D.C. this week, writing in a letter to the regulators, are saying, look, we have a law going back to 2005 when where the utilities voluntarily improve security at this, but we just don't know whether they're doing it. So what's going to happen now?
All right, Dominic, thanks so much. And joining me now, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear Forces in the Reagan administration, current president of the Center for Security Policy, Frank Gaffney. Frank, it's good to have you on. You are one of the most knowledgeable people on this issue. Can you answer the question of why what happened in San Jose, which appears to be a relatively well-planned, sophisticated attack on a substation, why it was quiet for so long?
I think a determined effort was made to conceal from the public what had happened. You can rationalize it as an effort to prevent copycats from repeating this elsewhere. You could also, I think, rightly conclude that, as has been the case consistently for years, Jeanine, we've seen the electric utilities try to conceal from the public the vulnerability of their infrastructure. And you used the term earlier in the program with my friend Jim Inhofe about cover-ups. This is, I'm afraid, a cover-up of one kind or another for whatever reason. And the public safety has been jeopardized not just because terrorists who conducted this attack deliberately, purposefully, skillfully are still at large, but because the grid is vulnerable to much more than just physical attack of this kind, and nothing is being done to remedy it. And I can't tell you how appreciative we are for the focus that you've been trying to bring to this needed corrective action.
But Frank, what stuns me is no one has been arrested or charged. You've got people shooting for 19 minutes, going into some kind of underground station to cut the telephone wires, and the FBI says, no, this is just vandalism, and we continue to sift through the evidence. You're kidding, right? Sift through the evidence. But let me move on to what can we do now. We understand, and you understand, and the viewers who've been watching Justice know that this can be devastating, and end of civilization as we know it. Why is everyone, why are the local power companies not doing anything?
I think there are two basic reasons, and it's not just the local power companies, it's the utilities sort of trade association, I think of it as, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC, which, as you mentioned in your earlier conversation, has this sweetheart deal under this 2005 legislation to basically be the regulatory agency. There's a federal agency called the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, but it doesn't have the teeth to do anything. It's up to NERC to decide what's going to be done and not done. And by the way, it generally doesn't want to do anything, I think because of cost concerns. But in the end, they'll pass those costs on to ratepayers.
Of course they will.
But the bigger problem is they don't want to jeopardize this sweetheart deal and have people telling them they have to invest in hardening the infrastructure against everything from this kind of attack, which has happened now. And this wasn't any dress rehearsal. This was a real and narrowly averted, successful destruction of a critical piece of the electric grid that would have blackened out, I'm afraid, probably Silicon Valley and much of the San Francisco Bay Area probably for years.
All right, so Frank,
with devastating effects.
What we have here is now we know the electromagnetic pulse can be the result of a solar flare, natural, or by a nuclear device detonated into the atmosphere. Now we've got people who are actually shooting at the electrical substations. So, and you know what? I don't buy for 1 minute the idea that, you know, they're worried about copycats. That's a bunch of hogwash. If they were worried about it, they'd do something about it. And so what is your organization doing to try to get legislation passed on this? The Center for Policy.
Well, we've put together a coalition. We call it the EMP Coalition. We're very pleased to have former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich and former Director of Central Intelligence under Bill Clinton, Jim Woolsey, as our honorary co-chair. We've pulled together the best minds in this country, I think, on the vulnerabilities of the grid and what needs to be done to fix it. The U.S. military, Jeanine, as you know, has been spending billions of dollars over 50 years hardening key parts of the military. So what do we use? We use surge protectors to protect the key things like these transformers that were nearly blown up in San Jose. We use capacitors to shunt some of the surge around them, and we can use physical protections, Faraday cages, and barriers of other kinds to protect them as well. These are practical measures. We know how to do it. They're not that expensive. We've got to protect particularly these 2,000 or so transformers that truly are the critical component of our 21st century society's survival.
All right, Frank Gaffney, always good to hear your insight. Thanks for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
All right, and joining me, former United States Secretary of Transportation, Ray LaHood, who is joining us from Peoria, Illinois. Secretary LaHood, in your view, how vulnerable is the American power grid?
Well, I think the incidents that you've been talking about tonight, Jeanine, and by the way, you focused on this like a laser beam, and people ought to be in your debt for the kind of attention that you've paid to this. I think that your previous guest, Frank Gaffney, with the work that he is doing now with this special group of people that are experts, really looking into this and hopefully coming out with some kind of a report, will play off of what you've been trying to do to get politicians' attentions in Washington, D.C.
Well, and you know, former Secretary of Transportation, how would a downed power grid affect ground transportation as well as aviation?
Well, look, we know that all of the transit systems that run around our country today are electrified by power grids, whether it's the metro system in Washington, D.C., or the trains that run in Chicago, or any of the other systems. You would have, Jeanine, you'd have a complete shutdown. If a power grid went down in a major metropolitan area, you'd have a complete shutdown of the major transportation systems in a major city. Now, when it comes to aviation, obviously, the airports have backup systems, but it would cause a state of panic.
How long would
if
a
that were
backup
to happen.
system last, though? How long would a backup system last?
Well, Jeanine, it would last long enough until people figured out how to get the system back up. There are good backup systems. This is so important to safety at our airports, and the technology that's used to guide planes in and out of airports. These backup systems would be there. But look at think of the thousands of people that use transit, that use other forms of transportation. Think of Amtrak, which is an electrified system along the Northeast Corridor. If the Northeast quadrant were shut down, it would cause a calamity.
Well, there's no question. But, Mr. Secretary, what is it going to take, you were a congressman also, to pass a law to protect our grid? This is it's not a partisan issue. This is to protect Americans. You've been in Congress. What kind of horse trading needs to be done to get this law passed?
Look at Jeanine. I think this needs the attention of somebody like our friend Darrell Issa, who chairs a committee that's investigated a lot of things. And what I suggest is that your folks get Darrell's attention on this. He's still the chair of a committee that could look into this, could hold hearings, could introduce legislation. I know Congressman Waxman from California has taken an interest in this. I know Governor Richardson, he's no longer in office. But to me, I think what you ought to be doing and others ought to be doing is get on the phone with Chairman Issa and say, hold some hearings and then introduce legislation. That would get the public's attention.
Well, the great ideas, and we're going to do that. Secretary LaHood, thanks so much for being with us this evening. Good to see you.
Thank you, Jeanine.
All right.
Thanks for all you're doing.
Thank you. Coming up, more on the power grid danger. How much would it cost to protect us? And who should pay the bill? And don't forget to vote in tonight's Insta poll. What do you think the government should do to protect the power grid? Facebook or tweet me at Judge Jeanine. And it was something like 20 minutes of shooting at the substation after they then cut the telephone lines. I mean, this is more sophisticated than just your run-of-the-mill vandalism, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, the head of the main regulator, better known as FERC, or the former head, I should say, he said these guys were well at the time. PG&E, the utility, claimed this was just vandalism. Now the former head of the regulator here in the United States says it was terrorism, something the FBI denies. It's caused an absolute furore, including, well, in Washington, where now a group of Democrat senators want to know from the regulators just how well protected the grid really is and whether Well, what happened in San Jose, this was April last year, and effectively there was an unknown number of gunmen who attacked the Metcalfe substation in Silicon Valley. They opened up with at least 100 to 150 rounds on power lines and on power stations and installation points. That caused part of the grid to go down. Fortunately, it didn't take out all of Silicon Valley, much as people feared it could have.
A sniper attack on a California electrical substation last year, now raising concerns all over the country. Was it terrorism? We've been on this story for the last month, but here with the latest is Dominic DiNatale. Hi, Dominic. Can you tell us what happened in San Jose?
Indeed, utilities have really taken adequate steps to prevent this from happening, and no one seems to know, and that's why it's turned into a debacle, Judge.
Well, you know, Dominic, what is unusual about this is that this thing happened last April, and we're now just hearing about it. It's as though nobody really cared until it kind of got out. But when you talk about the fact that you had a sniper attack, I understand